The spring air in Los Angeles carried the scent of jasmine through the half-open windows of Golden Harvest Studios, mixing with the sharp tang of sweat and leather from the training mats spread across the polished concrete floor. It was March 1973, and Bruce Lee, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds of condensed philosophy and precision, stood barefoot in the center of the room, demonstrating a chain punch sequence to a small group of martial artists gathered for a private seminar. His hands moved so fast they blurred, creating a sound like rapid drum beats against the heavy bag. Strike, strike, strike. 6 impacts in less than 2 seconds, each one landing on a different target zone with surgical accuracy. The bag swung violently on its chain, the metal groaning under the repeated assault. "It's not about individual power," Bruce said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd been talking all morning. "It's about continuous pressure, about overwhelming the opponent's ability to defend." The dozen men watching nodded, some taking notes, others recording the demonstration on Super 8 film cameras that whirred softly in the background. These weren't casual enthusiasts. They were black belts, instructors, competitive fighters who'd traveled from 3 different states to study with the man who was rapidly becoming a global phenomenon. Enter the Dragon was in post-production, and word of Lee's revolutionary approach to martial arts had spread through the fighting community like wildfire through dry grass. Bruce stepped back from the bag, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. At 32 years old, he'd spent nearly 3 decades refining his art, stripping away what didn't work, keeping only what proved effective in actual combat. His students called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But Bruce thought of it as something simpler. Truth. Truth in motion. Truth under pressure. Truth when everything was on the line. Dan Inosanto, Bruce's senior student and close friend, stood near the door, arms crossed over his chest. He'd seen this demonstration 24 times, but he never tired of watching the precision, the economy of movement, the way Bruce made physics itself seem like poetry. The studio door opened with a metallic clang that cut through the focused atmosphere like scissors through silk. 6 men entered, but only one mattered. He filled the doorway completely, 6 feet 7 inches of solid muscle packed into 240 pounds of boxer's frame. Joe Louis had won the United States Heavyweight Karate Championship 3 times. He'd knocked out 17 consecutive opponents in full contact matches. His hands, wrapped loosely in athletic tape, looked like sledgehammers at the end of tree trunk arms, and he carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never lost a real fight. "Louis," Dan said quietly, surprised. "Didn't know you. We're coming." Joe's eyes swept the room, cataloging the men, the equipment, the setup, and finally landed on Bruce, who stood motionless by the heavy bag, watching him with the calm attention of a scientist observing an interesting specimen. "Heard there was something worth seeing here," Joe said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "Wanted to check it out myself." The other men with Joe, fighters from his gym, all of them large, all of them carrying the physical swagger of competitive athletes, spread out behind him like a small platoon. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Bruce smiled slightly, but his eyes remained perfectly neutral. "You're welcome to watch. We're just demonstrating some basic chain-punching principles." "Chain punching," Joe repeated, rolling the words around like he was tasting something unfamiliar and not particularly impressive. He walked further into the room, his footsteps heavy on the concrete. "That Wing Chun stuff." "Adapted from Wing Chun," Bruce corrected gently. "Modified for practical application." Joe stopped about 10 feet away, looking down at Bruce from his considerable height advantage. The top of Bruce's head barely reached Joe's shoulders. The physical disparity was comical. A heavyweight boxer standing next to a lightweight actor. It looked like a man talking to his teenage son. "See, that's the thing I've been hearing about," Joe said, his tone conversational but carrying an edge underneath like a knife wrapped in velvet. "Lot of talk about practical application and real fighting, but it all looks pretty fancy to me. Pretty moves for the cameras." The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Dan shifted his weight slightly, ready to intervene, but Bruce caught his eye and gave the tiniest shake of his head. "Not yet. Let this play out." "You think what I teach is for show?" Bruce asked, his voice remaining perfectly level, almost curious. Joe shrugged, his massive shoulders moving like tectonic plates. I think there's ring fighting and there's movie fighting. I've done ring fighting my whole life. Real contact, real consequences. You get hit in the ring, you don't get to do another take. Several of Joe's companions chuckled, a low rumble of agreement. Bruce's students exchanged glances, uncertain. They'd seen their teacher handle challenges before, verbal ones, philosophical ones, even occasional physical demonstrations against skeptics. But Joe Louis wasn't some random loudmouth. He was arguably the most dangerous striker in the United States. His right cross had put men in the hospital. You're right, Bruce said simply, and Joe's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. In boxing, you face real resistance, real danger. That's valuable experience. But, Joe prompted, sensing the unfinished thought. But boxing has rules, Bruce continued, his hands relaxed at his sides, completely unthreatening. No kicks, no grappling, no strikes below the belt or behind the head. Those rules exist for safety, and I'm not criticizing that. But they create limitations, habits, assumptions about what a fight actually looks like. Joe's jaw tightened slightly. You saying my experience doesn't count? I'm saying your experience is boxing experience. Real, hard-won, absolutely legitimate, within the context of boxing. But a street fight? A survival situation? Bruce tilted his head slightly. Different context, different truth. That won't work, Joe said flatly, gesturing at the heavy bag at Bruce's hands at the training setup. All this rapid-fire hand stuff, this chain punching, that won't work against someone who actually knows how to fight, against someone with real power and real reach. You'd never get close enough to touch me. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Bruce stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds, just breathing, his chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. His face showed no anger, no offense, no ego rising to meet the provocation. Just that same calm, scientific attention. Then he smiled, genuinely, warmly, like a teacher who'd just heard a student ask the perfect question. Would you like to find out? Bruce asked quietly. Joe blinked. What? Would you like to test it? You and me, right now. No rules, no safety equipment. Well, maybe we should keep it above the belt. And no strikes to the throat because I'd like both of us to walk out of here intact. But otherwise, let's see if it works. The room went silent except for the distant sound of traffic on Melrose Avenue and the soft whir of the film cameras still recording. Joe looked at Bruce, really looked at him. At the slight frame, the lean muscle, the calm face, at the physical disadvantage that seemed almost absurd. Joe outweighed him by more than 100 pounds, outreached him by at least 6 inches. Had knockout power that Bruce simply couldn't match in terms of pure force. This should have been a joke. But something in Bruce's eyes, something perfectly calm, perfectly certain, made Joe hesitate. You're serious, Joe said. Completely serious. Unless you'd prefer to just keep talking about theory. Bruce's tone remained friendly, almost playful, but the challenge underneath was crystal clear. Joe glanced back at his friends who were watching with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. One of them, a heavyweight kickboxer named Mike, grinned and nodded encouragement. Show this movie star what real fighting looks like. Joe turned back to Bruce and cracked his knuckles, a sound like small branches snapping. All right, let's do this. But don't say I didn't warn you when— 13 seconds, Bruce interrupted softly. What? I'll need 13 seconds to demonstrate why it works. After that, if you want to continue, we continue. But 13 seconds should be enough to make the point clear. Joe laughed, a genuine, surprised sound. 13 seconds. You're going to prove your whole system works in 13 seconds? Against you? Yes. The absolute confidence in Bruce's voice, not arrogance, not bravado, just simple statement of fact, sent a ripple of electricity through the watching fighters. Even Dan, who'd trained with Bruce for years, felt his pulse quicken. All right then, Joe said, rolling his shoulders and raising his hands into an orthodox boxing stance, left foot forward, hands up by his face. 13 seconds, let's see what you've got, little dragon. The nickname, meant to be dismissive, mocking, didn't register on Bruce's face at all. He simply adjusted his position, shifting into a modified Wing Chun stance. Right foot forward, weight evenly distributed, hands low and relaxed, fingers loose. To Joe, it looked completely open. No guard, no protection. Bruce's hands weren't even up near his face. Amateur mistake, Joe thought, and felt a flicker of disappointment. This is going to be even easier than I thought. Someone count, Bruce said calmly. 13 seconds, starting now. Joe exploded forward, closing the distance with a boxer's footwork, his right hand cocking back to deliver a straight cross that would have ended most fights before they started. His fist accelerated toward Bruce's face with the speed and power of a professional striker. Cutting through the air with a sound like ripping fabric, it never landed. Bruce moved, not away. Into. He slipped inside Joe's punch so close that Joe's fist passed harmlessly over his shoulder, and Bruce's lead hand shot forward in a straight punch that struck Joe in the solar plexus. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to interrupt Joe's breathing and freeze his diaphragm for half a heartbeat. Before Joe could react, Bruce's other hand struck. Chin, ribs, chin again. A rapid-fire sequence so fast it looked like a single blurred motion. Pop, 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 pop. 4 impacts in less than a second, each one landing with precision on vulnerable targets. Joe tried to grab, to clinch, to use his size advantage, but Bruce was already gone, slipping to the outside of Joe's right arm, and now Bruce's hands were striking again. Throat, pulled at the last instant to avoid serious damage, jaw, temple, ribs, and Joe could feel himself backing up, his boxer's instincts trying to create distance, trying to reset. But Bruce didn't let him reset. Bruce advanced like water flowing downhill, constant pressure, his footwork eating up space faster than Joe could create it. And those hands, Christ, those hands, kept finding openings that shouldn't have existed, threading through Joe's defenses like needles through cloth. Joe threw a desperate left hook, trying to use his reach to create space, but Bruce jammed it at the elbow, collapsed the structure, and countered with 3 more strikes: kidney, liver, floating, rib. And suddenly, Joe's legs didn't feel quite as stable as they had 10 seconds ago. 10 seconds. Had it really been only 10 seconds? Joe tried to plant his feet, tried to throw a proper combination, but his body was no longer responding with its usual coordination. Something was wrong with his breathing, wrong with his balance. Bruce had done something, several somethings, that had disrupted the fundamental systems Joe relied on without him even fully registering how. And then Bruce did something that made Joe's blood run cold. Bruce stopped, froze completely, his lead hand extended and touching, just barely touching, the hollow of Joe's throat, right over the carotid artery. Not pressing, just resting there, like a teacher's finger pointing at a word in a textbook. 13, Dan said quietly from across the room. 13 seconds. Joe stood there, hands still raised in a guard position that had proven completely inadequate, breathing hard, staring down at Bruce's finger against his throat, and understanding with perfect, terrible clarity that if Bruce had wanted to, if he'd chosen to apply pressure instead of just touch, Joe would have been unconscious on the floor right now. Or worse. The room was completely silent except for Joe's ragged breathing and the continued whir of the film cameras capturing every moment. Bruce lowered his hand slowly and stepped back, his expression showing no triumph, no satisfaction, no ego. Just that same calm, scientific attention. That's how it works, Bruce said quietly. Not because it's fancy, not because it looks good on camera, but because it addresses the truth of what actually happens in a fight. Distance, timing, continuous pressure, target selection. You're strong, Joe, you're skilled. But you trained for a specific context. And when the context changes, the tools that worked before become limitations. Joe lowered his hands slowly, his face cycling through several emotions at once. Shock, confusion, shame, and finally, reluctantly, respect. I didn't, Joe started, then stopped, not sure what he'd been about to say. I didn't see it coming. I didn't think you were that fast. I didn't believe someone your size could do that. All of it was true. All of it felt inadequate to describe what had just happened. How? Joe finally managed. How did you? I'm faster than most heavyweights. I should have caught you at least once. Bruce smiled slightly. You're fast for a heavyweight boxer. But you move in patterns I've studied extensively. Every boxer does. Right hand follows left hand, weight shifts predictably, punches travel in specific trajectories. It's not a criticism, it's what makes boxing effective within its context, but those patterns become predictable to someone trained to see them. Joe ran a hand over his face, still breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the spots where Bruce's strikes had landed. Not bruised exactly, because Bruce had obviously pulled the power, but definitely present, like phantom touches that had imprinted on his nervous system. You held back, Joe said, and it wasn't a question. Of course. You're not my enemy. You're a martial artist testing ideas against reality. That's exactly what you should be doing. Bruce's tone carried genuine approval. Most people just accept what they're told. You wanted to test it. That takes courage. The compliment somehow made the defeat worse. Joe had come here to expose a fraud and instead had been treated with respect even while being systematically dismantled. Joe shook his head slowly. I was wrong about what I said, about it not working. You weren't entirely wrong, Bruce corrected gently. Chain punching wouldn't work if I just stood at distance and tried to outbox a boxer. You'd destroy me. But that's not how I fight. I create situations where my tools are superior, where your size and power become less relevant than timing and position. Joe looked at the floor, at his hands, at anything except the dozen pairs of eyes watching him process this moment. His friends from the boxing gym stood frozen near the door, their earlier confidence replaced by stunned silence. Mike, the kickboxer who'd grinned and encouraged this challenge, looked like he'd just watched someone walk through a wall. Can you teach me? Joe asked quietly, the words costing him something to speak. Bruce tilted his head, studying Joe with that same calm attention. You want to learn from me? After you came here saying my method doesn't work? Because I came here saying that, Joe said, finally meeting Bruce's eyes. I thought I knew what fighting was. I've been doing it my whole life. But you just showed me I was looking through a narrow window and calling it the whole world. The shame in Joe's voice was palpable. Not the shame of losing a fight, but the deeper shame of realizing how much certainty he'd carried about things he didn't actually understand. Bruce was quiet for several long seconds, and Joe felt the weight of that silence, felt the judgment he was certain was coming. He'd walked in here with arrogance and disrespect. He'd mocked Bruce's methods in front of his students. He'd challenged him purely to prove superiority. Why would Bruce waste time teaching someone who'd shown such disrespect? But then Bruce smiled, genuinely, warmly, and put a hand on Joe's shoulder. That's exactly why I'll teach you, Bruce said, because you were willing to test your beliefs. Because when the evidence contradicted what you thought was true, you were willing to change your mind instead of protecting your ego. Most people can't do that. They'd rather be right than grow. Joe felt something crack open in his chest. Some hard shell of defensive pride that had been there so long he'd forgotten it wasn't just part of who he was. I don't know what to say, Joe admitted, his voice rougher than usual. Say you'll show up tomorrow ready to work. We'll start with footwork, teaching you how to close distance against longer opponents without telegraphing. Then we'll work on Wing Chun trapping methods. By the time we're done, you'll be twice as dangerous as you are now, and you're already dangerous. The compliment was stated as simple fact, without flattery or manipulation. Bruce meant it. Joe nodded slowly, still processing everything that had happened in the last 60 seconds. 13 seconds of fighting that had demolished his entire framework for understanding combat. And now this, an offer of genuine teaching from someone he'd tried to humiliate. Tomorrow, Joe agreed. I'll be here. Good. Bruce turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying easily despite its moderate volume. This is what martial arts actually means, not my style versus your style, not traditional versus modern. It means testing your understanding against reality and being honest about what you find. Joe came here to test something. He was wrong about the conclusion, but right about the process. That makes him a martial artist, a real one. Several of the students nodded, understanding the lesson that was being taught on multiple levels simultaneously. This wasn't just about fighting techniques. It was about epistemology, about how we know what we know, about the difference between confidence and certainty. Joe's friends had started to recover from their shock, approaching slowly, their expressions a mix of concern for Joe and newfound respect for the small man who just redefined their understanding of what was possible. Mike stepped forward cautiously. That was, I've never seen anything like that. Most people haven't, Dan said from his position near the door, speaking for the first time since the exchange began. That's why they don't believe it until they experience it. Joe turned to look at his friends, his training partners, his fellow champions, the men who'd come here expecting to watch him expose a fraud. He saw in their faces the same confusion and recalibration he was feeling. We all got taught something today, Joe said quietly, whether we got hit or not. Bruce had already moved back to the heavy bag, examining it like nothing unusual had happened. Like he hadn't just systematically dismantled one of the most dangerous strikers in the country in less time than it took to tie a shoe. Let's continue with the demonstration, Bruce said, addressing the original group of seminar attendees. Joe's question was actually the perfect transition to discussing how chain punching integrates with trapping. When your opponent tries to defend against the straight line pressure, he launched back into teaching mode, his hands moving through techniques, his voice calm and professorial. The room gradually returned to its original atmosphere, focused, studious, intense, but with an undercurrent of electricity that hadn't been there before. Joe stood off to the side, watching, absorbing, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just experienced. Every assumption he'd carried about size, power, and fighting advantage had been challenged in 13 seconds. The certainty he'd built through hundreds of victories suddenly felt like a foundation, with cracks running through it. But underneath the discomfort was something else. Excitement. Because if he'd been wrong about this, what else might he be wrong about? What other truths existed outside the narrow window he'd been looking through? The afternoon sun shifted lower, casting long shadows across the training floor. Bruce continued teaching, his students continued learning, and Joe Louis, heavyweight champion, knockout artist, man who'd never truly been tested until today, stayed and watched, preparing himself to become a student again. 2 months later, Joe would corner Bruce at a tournament in Long Beach and tell him that integrating Wing Chun principles into his boxing had made him twice as fast and 3 times as dangerous. 5 years after that, he'd tell magazine interviewers that training with Bruce Lee had been the most important period of my martial arts education. But all of that was still future. In this moment, in this studio filled with afternoon light and the scent of sweat and jasmine, all that existed was the lesson. That real strength means being able to admit you were wrong. That real mastery means never needing to destroy someone when you can teach them instead. That 13 seconds can contain more truth than 13 years of certainty. And that sometimes the most important thing you can learn is how much you still don't know.